All right, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. Welcome to you if you're new. Thanks to everyone else for returning. Appreciate you all listening. And normally, you know, if you've been around before, that I generally like to kind of come in on a high note. I try to come in with some big energy. But I got to admit that this week, coming in with a big, hey, how's everybody doing kind of vibe didn't feel appropriate. Sure seems like the level of death and destruction and injustice in the world got dialed up a couple of notches. And I just feel like it needs to be acknowledged. It's so easy to become fearful with everything. One thing I definitely know for sure, though, is staying in and like watching stuff, YouTube or Netflix or TikTok Reels, or just staying in and being on the internet and the screens is not helping matters any. And you know, last week I was talking with my friends Jason and Emily about getting out there and participating in your local community. And I was talking about the workshops that I did recently in Manchester and Dublin, and how important it feels right now to like get back out there and get in a room with people again. And I also talked about how that feeling of kind of hope and purpose and meaning, it got challenged by life's grind, you know, by the car dying, you know, like just by having to face the mundane realities of your day to day. And I feel like my hopes for a revival of in-person connection was met with some further resistance in like a couple of different ways. You know, for example, I have a weekly teachers sangha where I meet with a group of very cool people and we talk about stuff that's going on and things that are important to us. And this week, after last week's podcast and all the stuff I've been talking about, one friend, shout out to Diane, she mentioned that, you know, she has a class that she teaches for 30 years or something. She said, I can't remember, but like a really long time. And for the first time in a long while, she noticed that there was more new people coming than her old regulars, that a lot of people who used to come to her class and be like her regular group of folks who were there for whatever, 10 plus years. Some of us have had students who came to our classes consistently for that long. A lot of those people, actually with the pandemic and everything, their lives changed and they moved and things are different. And so there's actually more new people coming than she can remember. However, the new people coming aren't always coming in the same way. And she specifically referenced people being on their phones during class and how they do all these things to communicate to people that, you know, we turn our phones off when we come to yoga class. And she's even like spoken to people individually about it in a kind way, you know, all the things that yoga teachers do to try to set boundaries so it's not disruptive to other people. Because if there's one place where we're not going to be looking at our phones, can we make yoga class one? So that was kind of the sentiment, like we were all sort of feeling the frustration of that, of not wanting to be like the dogmatic teachers of our past. Who I had a teacher, I remember, who if you like came a minute late, the door was locked, or if you weren't wearing the right clothes, you weren't wearing tight fitting clothes, you'd be admonished, you know, like there was a time where teachers were very strict about certain things, you know? But we've come a long distance from there where now we're all much more invitational and, we're all meeting people where they are in a different way now. But maybe there's still a line that needs to get drawn, So in any case, it came down to like actually right now, this idea I had of us getting back together, revival of the in-person. It's challenged in a new way because I think people, a lot of us, most of us, if not all of us, in some degree or another, have been conditioned into a new way of going out in a sense that even the idea that staying in and not going out is safer. It's a safer thing, because you don't want to get sick. And I get it. I understand we just came out of a pandemic and maybe that's a valid, important choice and everybody should do whatever they need to do to feel comfortable. But it seems to me everybody being huddled into their own little dwellings and on the screens watching all this stuff about what's going on in the world and feeling fearful is the exact opposite of what would would be the best thing for us to be doing right now. And I just feel like I need to acknowledge it. These challenges that we face now where we've normalized staying in, not going out, like our social muscles have atrophied. And I guess there's always been those people who were like, disruptive in class or whatever. That's not necessarily new, but there's something new about the way people are with other people in relationship to devices. And I don't know, it just seems like maybe some lines need to get drawn somewhere, and it just isn't as easy as I was hoping it would get to be. It wasn't like, oh yeah, we're social beings, we'll just all get back together again and it'll feel amazing, which did kind of happen for me with these workshops. But what I'm realizing is that was very specific, that was people who were coming specifically to kind of be with me. That wasn't just random new people dropping in. Like if I open a space, I was talking about that recently, about opening another brick and mortar yoga space. If I open a space in my neighborhood and just like random new people are coming in, chances are they're going to be more like the people that Diane was dealing with who are like on their phones. And even after I ask them not to, and then I don't know, I would say that I'm generally empathetic towards the situation. I just think it's incredibly hard right now to resist these mind capturing and altering devices that we're all carrying around, So all that's to say, feels like it was a challenging week on a lot of levels, and I'm guessing I'm the only one who has been feeling it, and I hope that everybody's hanging in there okay with it all. And this need I'm feeling to acknowledge what's happening and see if we can have conversations that might be useful in facing these challenges we're facing is what a lot of people might call embodiment. It's not a word that I use a lot myself, and I talk about that some today with my guest, Mark Walsh, who organized like the largest online embodiment conference ever. Some of you probably know who Mark is. He also has a podcast and a bunch of other stuff that he does. And I have been aware of Mark for many years. We had some correspondence. We do talk about that some today at the beginning of our conversation. And I've just sort of watched him from afar. I saw him as somebody who was kind of an early adopter in like coaching coming into the yoga world more. And I also just remember him being very provocative online. We talk about that some too. But this business of things evolving and changing and new priorities being set, all of this is stuff that I get into with Mark, and it was good to have a chance to finally connect with them. I'm glad to share it with you today. Real quick before we get to it, if you enjoy listening to this show and you had interest in connecting with me in other ways, there's lots of opportunities for us to do that. I've got ongoing live classes you can take. I've got discussion groups. I've got teacher training. And I've got some new stuff, some upcoming events that I'm looking to plan, because I do plan to get out there despite how hard it is. So one really good thing you could do is just go to the website and sign up for my free email list. And then you can keep up to date on all of my stuff. Everything, if you're curious, can be found at jbrownyoga.com. Okay, y'all. I think that's fine. I will touch base with you on the other side. But let's go ahead and get into it. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Mark Walsh.
Hey, Jay.
Hey, Mark. What's up?
Hey. That longer hair. I remember last time I saw you on something.
Oh, it's a new thing. This is what it looks like if I stop doing things to try to make it look a certain way. Like I just stopped cutting it to see what it would look like, and it's been quite a trip.
Cool. Are you in New York area? Where are you in the world?
I am in Pennsylvania. I moved about 2 hours away from New York into Pennsylvania back in 2017.
Yeah, I think I remember that. Yeah. Is this going to be video or just audio?
I tend to only use the audio for this show.
That's fine. Just because I've got a dirty T-shirt I've just seen, so that's perfect.
See, I tell people that we're not going to use the video because for that reason, because I don't want people to feel like they have to get dressed up or like have proper lighting or anything like that. And some people like the cameras on and some people like it off. And these days, I'm agnostic about it. So whatever people like better, I'm cool with.
Okay, cool. I mean, it's nice to see you. I find for rapport and just kind of seeing each other is nice. So, cool. What's your time frame? I'm basically, this is my last thing of the week, so I'm pretty chill.
Cool. Me too. I'm pretty flexible. We go for maybe an hour to an hour and a half, depending on how things roll. And if you don't have anywhere you have to be, I would love that.
Yeah, let's see how it goes. I'm a little tired just because it's kind of like, Friday, 5 p.m. It's been a hell of a fucking week as well. So, a little tired, but looking forward to it and happy to come on for sure. So, thanks for having me, basically.
Very, very cool. Well, listen, I'm already recording. I'll probably edit up some of the banter that we just had, if that's okay with you. Just consider us having begun.
Edit out the bit about the donkey, okay? Edit that out. Otherwise,
yes. Well, Mark, it feels like a bit of a long time coming for us to have a chat. We have spoken before. I don't know if you remember this. I was trying to go back in my mind, and I do believe it's maybe more than 10 years. I can't remember. It might have even, I think, been before I started the show, back when I was just kind of blogging. We had like Facebook interactions, but you reached out to me and scheduled a video call just like this, but it wasn't Zoom. It was Skype because there was no Zoom back then.
Wow.
And at the time I didn't get it. I was like, what's this guy trying to sell me something? But you were just reaching out and networking, I think like you were doing, I believe it was Purpose Black Belt back then.
Yeah. We were doing, I've been coaching people on purpose for quite a while. I still do that with mentees. And we had a course on purpose and embodiment. And I think we were kind of aiming it towards yoga teachers. So I was kind of like reaching out to some kind of like yoga people that I heard good things about, and maybe with an eye and having you as a kind of guest on that or something, probably.
Yes, I recall it. And I remember it was at a very interesting moment where I felt like some of the stuff that was happening with coaching, like in the corporate world, was starting to like find its way into the yoga space. And full disclosure, I remember being highly critical of it. I wrote this blog post kind of like calling out Elena Brower in the Handle group, and I got myself into all kinds of hot water. But I remember appreciating Purpose Black Belt because it was pretty like, I felt like it had like a kind of rock and roll vibe to it. I remember like, one idea that it was like, we'll get belts, like it had like a martial arts kind of structure, but it was based on like having purpose in your life. And I think what the second belt was called Unfuck Yourself. And I was like, oh, who's this guy who doesn't mind cussing, because that was very uncommon in the yoga space. It was a much more kind of pristine world.
I tell you what, I wish I'd trademarked, that is every personal growth book in the train stations now got F***K on it or S***T on it. And, but back I just come from an Irish family that's pretty kind of working class, and that was just normal how I grew up. I come from a sort of Irish immigrant family in a working class farm village, and that's just how I spoke, and I just thought I thought it was strange when people would have reactions to it, but that's sort of since become a bit fashionable. And the martial arts thing is because the martial arts was I first did yoga at 16, but then I discovered martial arts at 18, and I really went into that. And that was definitely like my biggest influence on embodiment, at least for the first sort of 10 years or so. I happened to have a Aikido teacher who did a lot of stretching, like, half an hour at least every class. So I kind of through that kind of got into sort of yoga as well. And, I lived in Brighton for a long time, which is a sort of home of Scaravelli yoga, a particular kind of like soft, somatically orientated yoga. So yeah, kind of the martial arts element, hence the belts, was very much in my
well, I would also say Aikido in specific. Like I've had almost no martial art experience, but the only times I ever went to a dojo and did a little stuff was at an Aikido dojo that my friend went to, who was very into it, and it did seem to have its own kind of characteristics in terms of like the way it was more about redirecting energies rather than like, I don't know, other types of more strike types of martial arts. There seemed other even kind of potential spiritual elements to it that weren't always the same. What was it about martial arts that did it for you more than yoga? You said you started with yoga, but then Aikido was the thing. Yeah. What was it about Aikido that was working for you that wasn't working with yoga?
There was a couple of things. One is like, I'm just naturally combative as a person. And like if I was born in another generation, they just would have given me a sword and sent me to the war, just kind of typologically. So martial arts made a lot of sense because I had that kind of typological kind of habitual embodiment. But at the same time, like I was kind of like a peace-loving hippie, and kind of went, okay, I don't actually want to kill anyone. So Aikido is the sort of non-violent martial art, or at least officially. And so that made sense. I think practically I was involved in some sort of criminal activities at the time as well when I started. So that it just sort of practically made sense to do a martial art again, because I didn't really want to hurt anyone, but it's like I had a kind of practical need. And honestly, I think on a sort of more mysterious level, I looked at Aikido and I remember seeing it and the flow and the beautiful movements, and something in me just went, you need that. And, I was suicidal as a teenager when I first discovered it. And I think it just something said, you need the discipline of it. And that was, I wasn't wrong about that. There was some instinctive genius that, there's not me that just went, do that or else you're going to die. And I'm glad I did it.
So it was a way to kind of give you discipline, something to focus on. That makes sense. Yoga did that for me too. A more like vigorous kind of yoga served that purpose initially to kind of whip me into shape.
Well, there's a spectrum like Aikido. So I've studied both ends of the spectrum. So on one end, you've got this really crash bang wallop hard, I did training in residential situations in the UK that was really very tough. And I was just in a lot of pain and hard work and cold showers every day. And it's really intense, austere training. And on the other hand, I've lived in Californian dojos that were kind of hippie and all about personal growth. And, and that really opened my eyes to the bigger scene of, for example, one of my teachers was a trauma healer, one of my main mentors is a trauma teacher, trauma educator, he calls himself. And that was like, whoa, okay, what's trauma? I had no idea. I had plenty of it, but I didn't know what it was. I wasn't, that made me interested in the more kind of spiritual or alternative or sort of side of things. So with Aikido, you've got a real spectrum there.
So you met that teacher, that trauma teacher, in the context of Aikido?
Yeah, so there was a peace project with the United Nations in Cyprus, and all people from different war zones, and people like, Greeks and Turks and Palestinians and Israelis and different people that came together to do Aikido. And it was a sort of Aikido-based peace project, so very, very niche. And in that, because I kind of loved Aikido, but after a certain while, I was like, okay, what's the point in throwing people around and twisting wrists? I mean, who cares? It's like who cares if you've got a great downward dog? Right? Who cares if, I had the same journey with yoga later, actually. Like, who cares if you've got, you can put your palms flat on the floor? Who cares? And the same thing with Aikido. I was like, well, who really, unless you're a bouncer or something, I didn't have a practical need. I cleaned up my life and didn't have a practical reason to need the skill, martial arts. So I was like, well, what are we really doing this for? And then this organization, we're doing it in peace building. And I thought, well, that's cool. My sister happened to be getting married in Cyprus. So I kind of, ended up volunteering. And then I met all these Aikido people who were doing it in these really interesting ways. And then I spent 3 years just traveling the world. I lived in the slums of Brazil, where one of them was working with street kids. I lived with a HIV awareness circus in Ethiopia. I spent time in the Middle East doing stuff around peace with it. And then one of my teachers there was a trauma expert. So that got me interested in trauma, which has become a big part of the embodiment work, obviously.
I got to be honest with you. I wouldn't have known anything about that in you from the Facebook bombs you were dropping back when I first came across you. You reached out to me, I mentioned, because it seemed like you had this stuff that definitely applied to people in the yoga world, and in a way, a lot of yoga teaching has moved in that direction. I had someone on recently and he was even talking about that, teachers moving in the direction of being transformational coaches. And so you were sort of one of the first people I remember you had already doing that work, but outside of the yoga world, it seems to me, like you're saying, first kind of in Aikido. When does it start to go from just Aikido to more coaching work? Because I know you worked in corporations and stuff, right?
Yeah, so I basically just did loads of Aikido. I was living Aikido student for about 3 years, traveling the world, doing that, had a great time, got thrown around a lot, had a whole experience that most people don't have, which for a young man full of testosterone was great. And then it sort of segued into youth work and peace work and kind of Aikido related projects with trauma and these things that, just mentioned. And then at a certain point I was like, okay, I'm kind of tired of living out of the bag. I'm tired of living in, war zones and dodgy places. Tired of kind of doing NGO work and having no money. And I thought, you know what, this actually applies to leadership, to personal growth. Let's work in business because they have money. And I didn't know anything about business. So I went and bought my first sort of cheap suit. And, I was the weird guy who would come into a business and do a stress workshop or a leadership workshop. And I kind of had to learn to speak business. It's kind of like learning another language. And that was kind of cool. And actually, I remember thinking, okay, I used to have these bad images of business people. But then I was learning a lot and realizing there's good people everywhere. And okay, you can do this non-athletically. You can do this without having to be thrown around or do crazy stuff. And that kind of opens up the coaching sphere. So studying embodiment coaching, these days I teach that. That's my main, for people listening, that's my main job. It's teaching coaches now. But at a certain point, we went, hang on a minute, I've done yoga for a long time, and a lot of my friends are yogis. Could we introduce us to yoga? Because what I saw was in yoga, there was a few tribes developing, yoga in inverted commas isn't one thing, right? With all the cool guests you have on, and it seemed like there was some really physical people that were doing Western but physical yoga, kind of athletic style. And then there was the sort of more esoteric people or the more kind of Eastern orientated people, which, I respect. I've spent time in Buddhist monasteries and I'm not against that in any way. But I realized there wasn't a Western but deep approach. There was an approach which was coming from a sort of Western psychological point of view rather than, say, more of a Hindu or Buddhist or that kind of tantric, that kind of perspective, which is great, but it's not everyone's cup of tea. Mm-hmm. So we said, okay, what would it be like to design a way of doing yoga which is focused on personal growth, psychological development, embodiment, rather than physicality or sort of esoteric transcendent spirituality. And basically, with over a few years, with a whole bunch of professional yoga teachers, designed a system. And that we did this called Embodied Yoga Principles. There's still people teaching it, doing it. In the end, and this might make you laugh, we decided the yoga world was just too much fucking hassle. And decided to teach the same system to coaches because we were like, this is way easier working with coaches because the yoga world, frankly, had got a bit screwed up by that point. It wasn't my mum's yoga. My mum used to teach yoga, and it's like the yoga world had really changed, and we were like, this, and I know you've had your ups and downs with it. We were just like, this is just too awkward and difficult, and people, no, we don't need this. So now I probably like 10% of my students are yoga teachers or dance teachers, but mostly people are doing the same stuff in a coaching context now. So a bit of a roundabout journey there. I don't know what's interesting.
No, it is interesting to me. I mean, I think it's, I guess what I want to, before we talk about what happened with the yoga world, I guess I'm curious first to spend a little bit more time just around this word embodiment, honestly, because I don't remember when we first spoke, when we first had our Skype call, I don't remember you using that word. You were an early adopter of like embodiment. I feel like it's one of those words on my list now that I almost never use. Like I might say to embody something.
Like a cliche or
like as a verb. No, only because it gets used it's so overused, or it almost loses its meaning at some point. And I guess my curiosity with you about it is that you did start using it earlier. And I know like somatic movement modalities, like the word embodying is like a term that's used, like embodying exercises. But it does seem different when you use embodiment, it kind of changes. So I guess I'm curious, when do you remember that word becoming like an identifier for you? And was there a particular kind of movement modality that you felt like you were drawing upon in using that word?
Yeah. Well, I'd say I've been sort of associated with about 15 years, and certainly the last 10 years pretty solidly. And, it's kind of, I certainly didn't invent the word. Obviously, the word goes back, and it has a kind of common sense English usage of like, Obama embodies leadership or something like that, right? Like it's got, a common sense English usage. And then it's got a more technical usage. So I started asking, and it's sort of, I'm one of the people who's definitely, it's kind of my fault that it's become a buzzword and it's been overused, like Embodiment Podcast, Embodiment Conference, like I kind of pushed that word hard.
There's embodied, there's like a lot of people have used it, and I understand why. That I think it's pointing to something that's important, but.
Well, look, for me, it was like, what do I call all this embodied arts that involve the body, but from the point of view of awareness and transformation. So not just from an exercise point of view, and not even just from a mindfulness point of view, not just being aware of the body, but being aware as a body, and being, saying, how do we change and develop ourselves through the body or with the body? And I realized, like, all these things I do for fun, like conscious dance and martial arts and yoga and all these, improv comedy, even body therapy. I realized there was they had something in common, because I talked to my friend who was, I don't know, a theater guy, and he'd be talking about the same stuff, right? Particularly certain schools of theater, or yoga friends, and they'd be talking about the same stuff, right? Or even like extreme sports people were kind of prototype, almost talking about the same stuff. And there's kind of Western side, there's an Eastern side. Now, somatics is a good word, but the reason I didn't use it is like, one, it's a bit like esoteric. It's a Greek word, and it's just not in the normal vocabulary. And it also has weird other medical uses and, this kind of thing. And the other one is it's actually a subset of what I would call the embodiment field. Yeah. So for me, embodiment is this subjective study of the body. So it isn't a vague word. It has a definition, and it has poetic definitions like who we are, which is a very deep 3-word phrase. And it's also a form of intelligence. So like, in my book, I break that down. Like, here's concrete. This is like when I'm working with a business, they like this version. It's like, here are the skill sets involved. You can be better or worse at self-regulation. Right? Like you can, in coaching, it helps if you can help regulate your client, it helps if you can regulate the coach. That's just one skill set, right?
So being embodied means you can self-regulate? Is that what we're saying?
Well, you can be consciously or unconsciously embodied. So we're all unconsciously embodied, meaning we have a set of habits, a way of being, which everyone can fucking see except us, right? Like, we're all unconsciously embodied. Like, a dog is unconsciously embodied. A dog can see your embodiment. Like, a dog knows if it's the boss or you're the boss, right? And that includes states and traits. So it includes, moods. Like today, I'm kind of in a good mood, but a bit tired, kind of how I am today. And it includes traits. Like, we have personalities that are embodied, that are less visible than states. And it includes a number of skill sets. So, for me, for someone to be consciously embodied, I'd say self-regulation would be a skill they would need. Empathy would be another one. Another set of skills would be like leadership skills. It's like someone says they're embodied. It's like, okay, can you make me laugh? Can you lead me? Can you turn me on?
I was going to take longer. I was going to take longer to get to this question, but you went right there. So let's do that, because even the words, like I said earlier, like I rarely use it. I'll say like embody something, but like to say becoming embodied. It's almost like you said earlier, like instead of becoming enlightened, in the same way I've always felt the same, like as though you weren't embodied and now you've become embodied. And you made an important distinction just now between like unconsciously embodied and consciously embodied. But I guess
so we're all unconsciously embodied, but we have a greater amount of embodiment from the conscious point of view. So that's a really good distinction that you were kind of picking up on there, just going, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah. And I guess my question around it is that sometimes when someone says you've become embodied, it's as though you've reached this state of like some kind of knowingness or purity or goodness. And I'm like, well, wait, you can embody a lot of things, couldn't you? Like you could embody some evil. You can embody evil.
Gollum, let's take one people know. Gollum embodies untrustworthiness, my precious, he embodies clinging. He embodies an addict, Gollum embodies all these things unconsciously, right? Like I'm just picking a character that people might know, Lord of the Rings, Gollum. So it could be negative as well as positive, right? So that's the idea of you embody something. If we're going to say you're more embodied, what are we talking about? So concretely, you're more deeply aware of more of your body, more of the time, right? Like that's the thing you can get better or worse at. Like you're way more embodied than a guy who watches TV all day, right? Like you're way more embodied than someone who's traumatized maybe and cut off from their body. Like as someone who had a long-term yoga practice, you will just be more consistently aware of your breath and your posture. Like we can have this conversation and notice our breath. Like that's a skill. My sister can't do that, right? But my sister is lovely and I adore her, but she's not aware of her breath in the same way. It's just not there.
I think I get it. It's what you're talking about is embodiment as like self-awareness, essentially.
Yeah, so it's one way of defining embodiment would be being more aware of more of the body, more deeply, more of the time, right? And that you could be greater or lesser at. That's something you can build, you can sustain. There are practices that would build that. We could extend that and say that's the base skill of all the other embodiment skills. So, for example, good luck self-regulating if you're not self-aware, right? Like you have to know you're angry before you can calm yourself down, right? And then we could build on that empathy. Well, if you're not self-regulated, good luck empathizing, good luck connecting with others, right? Like, that's essential. And then again, the fourth kind of set of skills there, leadership, influence, impact. Again, that's built on empathy, self-regulation, self-awareness. But so self-awareness is kind of where it all starts. So that's fair to say.
Yeah. And I think that's where there is a lot of crossover with yoga, where yoga is about often developing the ability to sense and be aware. I know for myself, I think I've heard you talk about this in interviews as well, where I was kind of trying to think my way into being a better person or being more healthy, reading a lot of things.
Yeah.
And being analytical about it. But at some point, you can't think your way into it. You have to be able to feel things.
Like, sometimes I joke, like Wikipedia hasn't solved all the world's problems, right? Like we've got all this information, but we're not that much better off as a society, as a world. Like knowing about things isn't the same as being able to do things, let alone deeply embodying things. And yoga is a great practice. Like I did yoga. When did I do yoga? 2 days ago. It's pretty something I still do. A teacher I trained with for over 10 years in Brighton, and I still study with online. Now I've moved. And it's good for certain things and not good for others. So it depends on the yoga practice, right? Like this, again, it's not one yoga. You're going to learn something different from acro yoga because it's relational than you are from Ashtanga, which is more of a form-based practice, as people know. So you can ask, what skills is it building? So body awareness, breath awareness, posture awareness, in most cases is going to be built through yoga, but not necessarily the relational side. Yeah, not necessarily. Now, if you're a teacher or you're doing partner yoga, that's different. There's exceptions, right? Like, problem with saying yoga is anything is there's always an exception, right? Generally, though, it would be a solo practice, which is great for, say, self-regulation, self-awareness. Aikido, you're going to learn something different. Tango, you're going to learn something different again, right? Because like dancing is not fighting. There's perfume, beautiful dresses, and high heels, and
you got to move your hips in a totally different way.
Yeah, I mean, there's not many times like keto, I'm like, oh, smell her perfume. That's interesting. It's just it's not the sort of relational dynamics are very different. And any style of yoga, we could say what's the embodiment is building. So by that, I don't mean that it's giving you big anterior deltoids from chaturanga or something, right? I mean, like, what's the way of being it's building? And different yogas definitely build different ways of being, though again, depends on how you do it and the teacher and, a bunch of other factors.
Yeah. It's interesting the way that words like embodiment or somatic kind of became like angles for yoga teachers or something. Like someone will say, I teach somatic yoga. And I'm like, what does that mean? Yoga is somatic. Like it doesn't.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
That's what I mean. Like, it's like the words kind of lost their meaning when they became just on the title of everybody's workshops and classes and stuff as just like trying to point. I think people were genuinely trying to point to something that was more experiential rather than like academic or something. But
well, yeah, not academic and not just exercise. I remember it was about 5 years ago. I was at a yoga festival, and the word embodied was just in front of every workshop that was there the year before. It was like embodied fish and chips, embodied whatever. And it was like, okay, cool, my work's done, in the world, great, the word's out. And then, these things it's like trauma, they get devalued. But then you just go back and you say, like, we have a definition problem in the whole embodiment field, right? Yoga, martial arts, everywhere. So one of my students said to me today, he said, what's the difference between grounding and centering? And I said, well, it depends who you're talking to. And I could define my version of those two things quite clearly. And that's, your teacher should be able to respond clearly with what they mean by embodied, even if it's different from my definition, right? That's fine. But there isn't a consistent way the word grounding or centering is used, for example. And it's just as long as we know what we're talking about, and then we can work with that and teach that, it's fine, And, maybe in 100 years, it would like science had this stage like this. There was a time in like the 17th century or 18th century where all scientists were using like totally different words for the same thing. And at a certain point, they started speaking the same language.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned trauma, because I think that that's also a thing that trauma work came into the yoga world, and everybody started being trauma informed or trauma sensitive, and everybody started doing like trauma informed modules, and there was all this stuff in the yoga world. And that kind of brings me back to when I first really, after that initial Skype call we had together, I just sort of followed from afar as you like got into it with people on Facebook. And you were one of the first people I remember who, like, part of me loved it because you were just like pissing everybody off. And then part of me was like, oh, to be honest, like, he's kind of a dick, but I like it because in a way you were saying things about, I don't know, the tendency towards wokeness and stuff that came to play later. Before I heard other people doing, you were calling something out before I even knew such a thing existed.
Okay. Well, the first thing is I am a bit of a dick. That's definitely the case. Okay. I fully own that. And I tend to be a bit of what's called bleeding edge, like a little bit ahead of the curve on certain things. And like, let's take the trauma one, right? Because I'd worked in war zones, because I had a teacher who worked with abused kids, I was really informed around trauma much earlier than was typical. So when I went to yoga studios, and I mean major yoga studios, and I was being adjusted without any kind of consent, and I was being touched inappropriately, and I was just like, this isn't cool. I really spoke up and said, guys, please, this is not okay. And that was unusual then. And people were like, look, it's my class. I'll adjust who I want. I know better than my students about their bodies. I just, do what I want. And I was like, no, not okay. And here's why, right? And I pissed a lot of people off also being critical of yoga. And the reason I'm critical of yoga is because I love yoga. It's because it has huge potential. It's the main embodied practice of the Western world, right? Whether we're like, not that many people do conscious dance. And the thing is, people get very attached to yoga or Aikido or anything because it helps them. and they build an identity around it. And then they kind of feel like I'm kicking their kitten if I'm being critical of an aspect of it, in this case, the trauma. Or it might be like saying, hey, yeah, Ashtanga yoga is great, but it doesn't cover all the bases. You might need to do some partner dance, or you might want to learn some martial arts in addition. It's just one practice, and people would get really upset. I think that's part of an attachment thing. And then the other one was the, sort of politically, what happened is, first of all, yoga was ignored. And then people went from trauma-informed to trauma-malformed. People went from trauma-educated to trauma-pandering. And then it became politicized. And all of a sudden, it was just a stick to hit people with and tell them they were bad people. I think particularly from an Irish family, and I've spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe, I had an awareness of sort of neo-Marxism and sort of, I studied a lot of history, so I could see a lot of the kind of Marxist tendencies and certain things that disguise themselves as just being nice. Like, he doesn't want to be nice. Let's be nice to each other. That's a good thing. But because of some of the training and the history I've had, I was able to go, okay, this is not cool. This is going to get ugly. And, it did. And we've all seen that in the yoga world, as well as meditation and other places.
Yeah. And I think there was also a thing where I keep going back to when I first met you back in whatever it was, 2014 or something like that. And I remember at that time, there was just a different world online where coming up with clickbait titles and kind of stoking controversy, it wasn't as dark or something. I don't know. Maybe it always was, and I was kidding myself, but
I don't think it was such a big deal. It was just particularly Anglo-Irish culture. You tease a lot, you kind of jive. It just wasn't that big a deal, particularly this side of the pond. And you know what? Sometimes I'd just be like on the toilet at 7:30 in the morning, and I'd just be about to my meditation. I'd just be taking a dump, and I'd sort of I'd just post something on Facebook, and I'd go about my work day, and I'd come back at 5 p.m. and there'd be this huge shitstorm, excuse the pun. Yeah. And I'd be like, oh, people really getting upset about stuff, it's not that big a deal, is it? I think I've since got more cautious, actually, because I've realized that you're making a permanent record, and people love to kind of bring posts of mine up from 10 years ago or something. And I'm like, dude, I didn't even think about that before posting it, and I realized that, to be fair, I realized I have to be a bit more responsible here, and this is a permanent record. And, I wasn't a public person 10, 15 years ago. Like, now I go, okay, if I say something, maybe thousands of people will see it, and there's a responsibility that comes with that. And I was just talking shit with my friends, like that was the kind of more the tone of it. And
I felt the same way. Like I was just having fun and talking shit and stuff. And then at some point, like that would often lead to good common threads even, but at a certain point it did get kind of dark where like people were so angry, like they want to destroy someone's whole livelihood and stuff. And it became a different atmosphere. Like stuff got.
I had someone follow me on Facebook, screenshotting my supposedly worst Facebook post and put them in a little file and saving them for takedown attempts years later. And I just thought, wow, what's going on with these people? Like, what kind of a life have they got? It's sort of strange, and people feel threatened. And I'd never attacked individuals. I was never into being nasty to individuals, but I would be quite hard on a topic, like yoga or trauma or something. Right? I'd say things about a topic that people strongly disagreed with. But, I never believed in being nasty to individuals. You'd be hard pressed to find a post, where I'm kind of like canceling someone or taking someone down personally. It's more about a topic. And as I said, people get very attached to yoga or martial arts or anything else.
Yeah. And it does seem like at some point I saw like you retreated some from like trying to engage with people on the social media platforms in that way and kind of started focusing on other stuff. I mean, at least that's what I did. It seemed like you did too, because at some point it just became pointless or something.
Yeah, I mean, partly it's just a focus thing of like, hey, I want to do things in the world. Partly I sort of realized like, hey, this actually brings out the worst side of me. And other people, these platforms are extremely bad for us psychologically. And I go, you know what? I had a really difficult conversation yesterday. Not difficult, big disagreement with a friend talking about immigration, but we both listened to each other. We both heard each other's views. We've maybe different politics, but it was like not that big a deal. And I just thought most people in real life are reasonable. They're okay. But the internet kind of turns off our empathy, makes everyone feel threatened. People feel safe behind the screens. They attack people the way they wouldn't in real life. And it brings out the worst in people. So at a certain point, you know, like I was on a podcast called Trigonometry not long ago. It's a sort of British Joe Rogan kind of thing, quite a big British podcast. And they were like, don't read the comments, Mark. Don't read. They were like, great interview. You did brilliant.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.